The poison arrived at the Riverside Public Library on October 14, 2024. It was hidden inside a thermos of homemade soup, prepared by a quiet librarian named Evelyn Hart. The intended recipient was her supervisor, Library Director Linda Graves. By the end of the day, Graves would be dead. What looked at first like a tragic case of sudden illness was, in fact, a calculated act of murder. And this crime had been planned for months. Graves collapsed at her office desk in the early evening. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but she never regained consciousness. Within 18 hours, she was pronounced dead at Riverside General Hospital. Her sudden passing stunned the community, but nothing about this case was simple. Behind the walls of the library, tensions had been building. Hart had uncovered troubling information about her boss and quietly documented everything for over a year. When her private investigation was discovered, her career and reputation were threatened. Instead of backing down, she made a fateful decision, one that turned a workplace dispute into a lethal betrayal. The murder weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a highly lethal toxin, carefully extracted from castor beans grown in a suburban garden. A poison that leaves almost no trace. The truth behind the librarian's revenge would only be revealed piece by piece, as investigators uncovered a crime no one in Riverside could have imagined. The city of Riverside, Massachusetts, was known for its quiet neighborhoods and historic landmarks. At the center of town stood the Riverside Public Library, a century-old building with towering columns and rows of oak shelves. It wasn't just a place for books. It was considered the community's heart. Among its long-serving staff was Evelyn Hart, a 46-year-old librarian who rarely drew attention to herself. She was polite, punctual, and methodical, blending into the quiet routines of the library. To most patrons, she appeared ordinary. Yet behind her reserved demeanor, she carried skills and knowledge from an earlier career as a pharmaceutical researcher, skills she kept to herself. Her supervisor, Linda Graves, was a commanding presence. At 52, Graves had built a reputation as a strong administrator and decisive leader. She handled budgets, oversaw programs, and maintained close ties with the Riverside City Council. To many, she was efficient and ambitious. To her staff, she could also be harsh and dismissive. The relationship between Hart and Graves was professional on the surface, but tension ran beneath it. By the fall of 2024, those tensions had grown into a private conflict, one that would soon transform the library from a place of learning into the center of a murder investigation. On the morning of October 14, 2024, Evelyn Hart arrived at the Riverside Public Library just after 8 a.m. She carried her usual tote bag and a stainless steel thermos filled with what she described as a homemade soup recipe. It wasn't unusual for Hart to bring food to work, and nobody questioned it. By late morning, she placed the thermos in the staff kitchen, labeling it with a sticky note marked for Linda Graves. Staff assumed it was a peace offering Hart had occasionally prepared meals for her supervisor during busy periods. Graves, known for her long hours and heavy workload, rarely had time to leave her desk for lunch. At 12:45 p.m., Graves retrieved the thermos and took it to her office. Several staff members noticed her carrying it down the hall. She consumed most of the soup over the course of her lunch break, remarking to an assistant that it tasted a bit bitter. But she dismissed the thought. By 3 p.m., Graves began experiencing severe nausea, dizziness, and abdominal pain. At first, she attributed the symptoms to food poisoning, but her condition rapidly deteriorated. She staggered into the hallway, clutching the wall for support, before collapsing outside the library archives room. Staff immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Graves barely conscious. She was rushed to Riverside General Hospital, where doctors attempted to stabilize her. Despite intensive treatment, her organs began to shut down. By dawn the following morning, Graves was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was initially unclear. Doctors suspected toxic ingestion, but could not immediately identify the substance. Her sudden and unexplained death left staff members stunned. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hart continued her work quietly. She assisted with routine library duties, filed circulation reports, and left at her usual time. She showed no outward signs of distress and did not draw suspicion in the early hours. Following Graves' collapse, police were notified of a possible poisoning and began preliminary inquiries. Investigators asked staff about Graves' recent meals. Several mentioned the thermos of soup Hart had delivered. The thermos was quickly recovered from Graves' office. Inside were residual traces of a dark, viscous liquid. Forensic testing soon revealed the presence of ricin, a highly potent toxin derived from castor beans. Even in small doses, ricin causes multi-organ failure, and there is no known antidote. The discovery turned a suspected case of food poisoning into a homicide investigation. Investigators traced the toxin back to Hart's modest home in the suburbs of Riverside. In her backyard, they found several castor bean plants growing among her garden vegetables. Hidden inside her shed were crude but effective tools for extracting and refining the poison. Evidence indicated that she had been cultivating the plants for months. Hart's history provided further context. Years earlier, she had worked briefly in pharmaceutical research, where she developed a strong understanding of toxic compounds. Though she left the field for a quieter life in library sciences, her scientific background gave her the knowledge needed to produce ricin. Police also discovered files Hart had compiled on her supervisor. These documents included financial records, budget reports, and copies of emails suggesting that Linda Graves had been embezzling funds from the library's children's program budget. Hart had gathered this evidence over more than a year. It became clear that the murder was not impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and tied directly to the conflict between Hart and Graves. In less than 48 hours, the quiet librarian became the prime suspect in one of Riverside's most shocking crimes. The investigation into Linda Graves' death quickly escalated from a case of sudden illness to a full-scale homicide inquiry. The toxicology report left no doubt. Ricin had been the cause. With that confirmation, detectives understood they were dealing with a deliberate poisoning, and the responsibility for unraveling the crime fell to Detective Marcus Hawley, a seasoned investigator known for his methodical, fact-driven approach. Hawley began by reconstructing Graves' final hours. At the Riverside Public Library, witnesses confirmed that Graves had consumed the soup left by Evelyn Hart. Several employees remembered Hart specifically mentioning that she had prepared the meal for her supervisor. The sequence was straightforward. Hart delivered the soup. Graves ate it. Hours later, she collapsed. The thermos was collected, tested, and found to contain traces of ricin, providing an undeniable link between the poisoned meal and Graves' death. Attention turned quickly to Hart's personal life. A search warrant for her home revealed more than investigators expected. Behind her modest house stood a small garden filled with castor bean plants. While not illegal to grow, the presence of the plants raised immediate suspicion. In her garden shed, police discovered jars, filters, and gloves, all showing traces of ricin residue. The setup was crude, but effective, more than enough for someone with Hart's background in pharmaceutical research to produce lethal doses. The discovery connected her not only to the delivery of the soup, but also to the means of manufacturing the toxin itself. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered another dimension to the case. Inside Hart's desk at the library, they found a folder filled with budget records, correspondence, and personal notes. Graves' name appeared repeatedly in Hart's annotations. The documents revealed financial irregularities within the library's accounts. Hart had highlighted missing funds from children's literacy programs, a discrepancy amounting to thousands of dollars. The notes indicated that Hart had been quietly compiling evidence of Graves' misconduct for over a year. Alongside these files, investigators found a calendar marked with cryptic notations. The entries lined up with gardening cycles, extraction processes, and preparation stages. Each date appeared to match steps in the production of ricin. For Hawley, this was a volley turning point. The documents established motive, while the calendar suggested deliberate planning. Hart had not acted impulsively. She had been preparing for months, if not longer. The autopsy of Linda Graves reinforced the case. The medical examiner reported that her death aligned perfectly with ricin poisoning. There were no underlying health issues that could explain her rapid organ failure. The symptoms, the timeline, and the toxicology results all pointed to a deliberate act. When questioned, Hart initially maintained her composure. She admitted preparing the soup, but insisted it was nothing more than a kind gesture. She denied any knowledge of ricin. But the evidence told a different story. The contaminated equipment in her shed, the castor bean plants in her garden, and the residue inside the thermos all spoke against her denials. Detective Hall pressed forward, connecting each piece of evidence to form a clear narrative. Hart prepared the poison in her shed, extracted it from her castor bean plants, and introduced it into the soup she carried into the library. Graves consumed it, fell ill, and died within hours. The files found in Hart's possession suggested that she had a clear grievance with her supervisor, and her preparations showed intent far beyond coincidence. Interviews with colleagues added weight to the findings. Staff recalled that while Hart was quiet and efficient, her relationship with Graves was strained. They described Graves as controlling and dismissive, and Hart as meticulous and increasingly frustrated. None had imagined the conflict could escalate to murder, but in hindsight, the tension was unmistakable. By late October, Detective Hawley and his team presented their findings to the district attorney. The case against Hart was comprehensive. She had access, expertise, and motive. The forensic evidence tied her directly to the production of ricin. The poisoned soup linked her to the act itself, and the documents she had collected on Graves pointed to a personal conflict that had grown over time. Hart was arrested at her home without resistance. She faced charges of first-degree murder and unlawful possession of a biological toxin. As she was taken into custody, Hawley considered the investigation nearly complete. The evidence against her appeared airtight. Still, one detail lingered in his mind. The financial irregularities Graves had been involved in suggested broader corruption within the Riverside City Council. Hart had uncovered more than just missing funds. She had been building a case that might have exposed a deeper scandal. Her choice to resort to poison left those questions unresolved, but for Hawley, they remained part of the shadow surrounding Graves' death. What had begun as an unexplained collapse inside a library had become one of the most complex cases Riverside had seen in years. The investigation revealed not only a carefully executed poisoning, but also a web of secrets hidden beneath the surface of the town's most trusted institution. The arrest of Evelyn Hart seemed like the final chapter. Investigators believed they had uncovered a clean and direct case. A librarian who poisoned her supervisor out of anger and betrayal. Yet as prosecutors began preparing for trial, new evidence shifted the narrative in unexpected ways. The first twist emerged when analysts examined the budget files Hart had collected. What initially appeared to be simple embezzlement by Linda Graves was part of something larger. Cross-referencing library financial records with Riverside City, council ledgers revealed that the missing funds had not only benefited Graves, but had also been funneled into unrelated city projects. Money earmarked for children's literacy programs had been diverted toward council members' private interests, including real estate deals and campaign expenses. Hart's files contained only fragments of this pattern, but investigators realized she had been close to exposing a much wider scandal. The second twist came from Hart's garden. Forensic experts confirmed that ricin production had occurred there, but further testing revealed something unusual. The toxin in the soup contained chemical stabilizers. These additives suggested advanced processing methods beyond what investigators initially believed Hart was capable of producing in her backyard shed. This raised an unsettling question. Had Hart acted entirely alone, or had she obtained assistance from someone with more sophisticated knowledge of biochemistry? Attention turned once again to the community surrounding the library. A forensic sweep of Graves' office uncovered a hidden USB drive taped beneath her desk drawer. On it were encrypted files containing detailed records of her financial transactions and communications with outside partners. Once decrypted, the drive revealed that Graves had been in communication with a local investment broker, funneling money through the library's accounts into private ventures. These revelations not only confirmed Hart's suspicions, but also introduced another potential motive. If Graves' corruption had been exposed, several influential figures within Riverside stood to lose significantly. Meanwhile, investigators reviewing surveillance footage from the library uncovered another surprising detail. On the morning of the poisoning, Hart had indeed brought in the thermos, but she was not the only one seen near Graves' office. A counsel aide identified as Mark Ellison was captured entering the office shortly before Graves consumed the soup. While there was no direct evidence linking Ellison to the toxin, his presence added another layer of suspicion. The most dramatic revelation came from a lab report issued weeks later. While ricin was undeniably present in the thermos and in Graves' system, trace amounts of the toxin were also detected on the USB drive and on papers stored in Graves' office. This indicated that the poison may have been handled by someone other than Hart, possibly as part of an effort to contaminate evidence or conceal a broader conspiracy. These findings complicated the prosecution's narrative. Hart remained the prime suspect. She had the plants, the equipment, and the opportunity. But the stabilizers in the ricin, the presence of other potential suspects, and the discovery of systemic corruption forced investigators to broaden their view. What began as a straightforward poisoning now appeared intertwined with a network of financial crimes and political misconduct. Detective Marcus Hall presented the new evidence to the district attorney. The prosecution weighed whether Hart alone could be responsible or whether she was a single piece in a larger puzzle. The theory emerged that Hart may have accelerated her actions after realizing that Graves' influence with the council would protect her from exposure. Yet the stabilizers in the poison and the presence of other individuals near the scene suggested that Hart's role might not have been as solitary as first believed. Reporters covering the case seized on these twists. Headlines shifted from "Librarian arrested for recent murder" to "Library murder exposes City Hall scandal." The public perception of Hart also began to change. While she remained accused of murder, some saw her as a whistleblower silenced by corruption. Others viewed her as a dangerous criminal who had taken justice into her own hands. By the time the trial date approached, prosecutors faced a dilemma. The evidence against Hart was strong, but not absolute. The stabilizers in the toxin, the contaminated documents, and the involvement of city officials complicated the narrative they hoped to present to a jury. The plot twists ensured that the trial would not be a simple matter of proving Hart guilty. Instead, it became a broader confrontation, pitting Hart's alleged crime against the corruption of Riverside's institutions. What had begun as a murder case was now a public reckoning, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Evelyn Hart had poisoned her supervisor. Of that, the evidence left little doubt. But the story did not end there. The revelations about corruption, hidden files, and chemical additives in the toxin suggested that the librarian's act of revenge may have intersected with something much larger, a system of betrayal that reached far beyond the walls of the Riverside Public Library. By the spring of 2025, the case of Evelyn Hart moved from the shadows of the Riverside Public Library to the public stage of the county courthouse. The courtroom filled with reporters, community members, and city officials, all eager to see how the state would handle a case that had grown far beyond a single act of murder. Hart was formally charged with first-degree murder, possession and use of a biological toxin, and tampering with evidence. Each charge carried severe penalties, with the murder charge alone placing her at risk of a life sentence without parole. Prosecutors sought to present the case as straightforward. Hart had motive, opportunity, and the scientific background to produce the poison. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out a clear timeline. They described Hart's work in her backyard shed, the cultivation of castor beans, the extraction of ricin, and her preparation of the thermos of soup. They emphasized surveillance footage, showing her carrying the container into the library. On the morning of the crime, forensic experts testified about the presence of ricin in the thermos and engraved system, tying it directly to the plants found in Hart's garden. But the defense countered with a broader narrative. They argued that while Hart had indeed researched and experimented with toxins, the stabilizers found in the poison proved that she had not acted alone. They pointed to the contaminated USB drive and papers from Graves' office as evidence that someone else had handled ricin. The defense painted Hart not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a scapegoat in a case tangled with city corruption. Detective Marcus Hawley was called to testify. He described the meticulous process of the investigation, the evidence collected, and the chain of events that led to Hart's arrest. Under cross-examination, however, Hawley was pressed on the role of Mark Ellison, the counsel aide who had been spotted entering Graves' office shortly before her death. While Hawley admitted Ellison's presence raised suspicion, no direct link had been established between him and the poison. The defense seized on this as a sign that investigators had narrowed their focus prematurely. As the trial continued, the financial scandals surrounding the library came into sharper view. Witnesses from the Riverside City Council testified under subpoena, revealing that Graves had indeed funneled money into private ventures. Though not directly tied to her murder, the revelations weakened the prosecution's narrative of Graves as an innocent victim. The defense suggested that multiple people had motives to see Graves silenced. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense when the USB drive evidence was introduced. Digital forensic experts confirmed the files contained encrypted financial records implicating several city officials. Traces of ricin were also found on the device, though the prosecution argued this contamination could have come from Graves herself after handling the poison thermos. The defense countered that the contamination proved the poison had circulated in Graves' office beyond Hart's direct involvement. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to simplicity. They reminded jurors that Hart possessed the plants, the knowledge, and the access. The poison had been delivered in a thermos she brought into the library. While corruption may have surrounded Graves, only Hart had the means and opportunity to carry out the poisoning. The defense urged jurors to look at the broader picture. They acknowledged Hart's actions, but insisted reasonable doubt remained. The stabilizers in the ricin, the presence of Ellison, and the financial scandal suggested that Hart had been only one piece in a much larger, more complex puzzle. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. Their decision reflected both the strength of the evidence and the uncertainty surrounding the wider corruption. Hart was found guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree. The jury determined she had intentionally caused Graves' death, but left open the possibility that the crime had not been premeditated in the precise way the prosecution claimed. She was also convicted of possession and use of a biological toxin, a charge that carried its own heavy penalty. In the end, Evelyn Hart was sentenced to 35 years in state prison. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but it left lingering questions. The role of Ellison was never fully resolved. The corruption tied to the council continued to unfold in separate investigations. And the mystery of how ricin stabilizers were introduced into the toxin remained unanswered. The trial had delivered a conviction, but not complete clarity. For Riverside, the case closed in the courtroom, but continued in the shadows of city politics. The murder of Linda Graves and the conviction of Evelyn Hart left Riverside shaken. A public library that once stood as a symbol of community had become the site of a carefully executed poisoning. The case exposed not only the deadly precision of a woman who hid in plain sight, but also the corruption woven into the city's leadership. For the people of Riverside, the trial's outcome provided some measure of closure. Hart would spend decades behind bars, serving time for the calculated killing of her supervisor. Yet the unanswered questions kept the case alive in public memory. Who else had access to the ricin? Did others within the city's council have deeper involvement than investigators could prove? And was Hart truly acting alone, or had she become part of something larger that never reached the courtroom? The library reopened its doors months later, its shelves restocked and its programs reinstated. But for many residents, the building would never carry the same sense of safety again. It had become a reminder that betrayal and revenge can take root even in the most ordinary settings. True crime stories often reveal the extremes of human behavior. In Riverside, the quiet determination of a librarian collided with corruption at the highest levels of local government. The result was a crime that stunned a community and left a legacy of suspicion that lingers to this day. As we close this case, one question remains for you to consider. When justice is compromised by power and betrayal is met with calculated revenge, how much of the truth do we ever really know?